Good evening, unless you're watching this at any other time of day. I'm Sinead Cox. I'm the acting senior curator at the Huron County Museum and at the Huron Historic Jail in Goderich, Ontario. Since the Huron Historic Jail is temporarily closed this season, I wanted to share a few stories about the folks who lived and died at the jail. And since Halloween is right around the corner, this video is going to be about someone who died at the jail and what happened to unclaimed human remains in Ontario jails at the turn of the 20th century. The Huron Historic Jail, for those of you who haven't had a chance to visit, was operational from 1841 until 1972. And in that time, we know of around 60 inmates who died while committed there. And although the jail was the site of 3 executions, 2 public and 1 private hanging, most of these deaths were from natural causes. And execution was very rare, and most of the prisoners at our jail that were sentenced to hang had their sentence commuted. The jail was the first municipal building in the Huron district, and these were the days before OHIP or long-term care facilities, and it became the last resort home of the poor, the ill, the elderly, in some cases unwed mothers. And as a result, many of the prisoners in the mid and late 19th century were not by any definition criminals, but often people that just had nowhere else to go. And one of these prisoners was Elizabeth or Elspeth Shepherd. She was born in Scotland around 1813 as Elspeth Jameson, and she had married a fellow by the name of Henry Shepherd. And his livelihood was the pension he received for his over 30 years of service in the British Army. The couple were living in Goderich in the late 19th century when Henry died under what would later be termed suspicious circumstances. And the virtual background's hiding my air quotes, but I think you get the idea. On an October morning in 1893, Elspeth showed up unexpectedly at the home of her neighbor at 6 a.m., exclaiming that Henry was dying. When the neighbor went to investigate, he thought that Henry had actually been dead for quite some time, and he notified the local coroner and the mayor of town. According to the Huron expositor, Henry had been addicted to indulging in strong drink, and his death occurred after one of his periodical sprees. With the mayor's permission, Henry was hastily buried. And again, quoting the Huron expositor, with no garments save a shirt and a pair of stockings, which would have been considered quite shocking by the standards of Victorian funerals. The county crown attorney actually thought this rush burial was so suspicious that an exhumation was ordered on the body for a post-mortem exam. And this turned up no incriminating evidence, so the body was reburied. And in fact, the rushed and sort of haphazard burial may have had more to do with the couple's economic situation than suspicious circumstances, although I don't know. In census records, Henry is recorded as both a laborer and a pensioner, while newspaper accounts described him only as a well-known Goderich character. So it didn't seem that any of those were extremely lucrative and that he had much assets beyond his army pension. So that left his widow in pretty dire financial straits in her old age. She would have been about 80. Exactly 1 year and 1 day after Henry Shepherd's death, Elspeth was homeless in Goderich Township and sentenced to 3 months in jail by the police magistrate's court for vagrancy. The jailer and jail surgeon guessed her age to be about 83 at this time. And although she was very mentally sharp, she was in extremely bad health and too feeble to actually leave the jail when those 3 months were up. So she lingered on at the jail for almost another year, just physically incapable of going out on her own. By August 1895, she was bedridden and unable to move from her cell. The jail surgeon, Dr. Shannon, treated her with milk and spirits, which would have been a special diet. But he said she craved a great deal more stimulants than I was willing to give. Elspeth died at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on September 10th, 1895. And when a prisoner died in jail, an inquest was always required where the so-called usual verdict of natural causes could be declared by the coroner, and the jail staff and any prisoners who were privy to the prisoner's health would testify. In Elspeth's case, the natural causes were deemed to be senile decay or essentially old age. And when a prisoner died, friends, family, or community members had 24 hours to come forward to claim their body for burial in their home community. And you will actually find prisoners that passed away inside the Huron Historic Jail buried in cemeteries and plots all across Huron County. And it was the responsibility of the family, or sometimes even service organizations like the Masons, if the prisoner was a member, to hire a horse-drawn hearse to collect the remains and also to cover those burial expenses. But in the case of Elspeth Shepherd, there was no one that stepped forward to claim her. There were no friends in the community, no neighbors that came forward to cover her funeral expenses. And in a case where no bona fide friend stepped forward within 24 hours, jail officials were to release the body to the local inspector of anatomy. Local inspectors of anatomy were appointed by the Ontario government. They were usually local undertakers, and their job was to take charge of these unclaimed human remains if they had died in a public institution, and convey them to medical colleges to be used in research so that the bodies could be dissected or examined by medical students. Elspeth's remains were thus taken into custody by Mr. Brophy, local undertaker and inspector of anatomy, to be transported to Toronto. At the last hour, however, the very last hour, her body was ready to be transported. Elizabeth's long-lost brother, who nobody had expected, arrived and claimed his sister for what was deemed a decent burial. Although Elspeth did receive a traditional burial, the bodies of other inmates in the jail's history who had no family, or even who had family but they were unable to pay those funeral costs, were transferred to Toronto colleges. So this is something that did happen to other inmates who passed away at the jail. Only a few months after Elspeth's death, in December 1895, Huron County's House of Refuge finally opened in Tuckersmith Township. And this is something that had been debated by County Council for decades, providing housing for the poor and elderly that was not the jail, that was actually designed as a refuge for people who could not financially or physically care for themselves. The House of Refuge did not follow the letter of the law and actually buried inmates on sites, on the property. And this was actually somewhat illegal because they were supposed to notify the inspector of anatomy for those deaths. But today, Huron View Home for the Aged is on the site of the House of Refuge. And if you walk it on the grounds, you will actually still see a cairn that is dedicated to the Huron residents buried there, somewhat illegally. This is just one story of an inmate at the Huron Historic Jail, and there are so many amazing stories, both about life in the jail and some of the shenanigans and crimes that got people into jail. And if you'd like to learn more, I always encourage people to check out the wealth of information available in our historical newspapers, which are available at huroncountymuseum.ca. You'll also find our blog there under stories, and there are some more detailed stories about the jail there as well. And if you have a story about something spooky or local cemeteries or monuments, or any questions about the history of the jail, please share in the comments. We would love to hear from you. Happy Halloween, everybody.